All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 8 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. My name is Bowie Madison. I have had type 1 diabetes for 21 years. I am healing and I'm sharing things as I go. So, this is episode 8 here. We are talking about the genetic fallacy of type 1 diabetes, the misconceptions and the stories we've been told as diabetics from diagnosis on about the genetic origin of diabetes and how we end the victimhood of the genetic lottery. And we'll talk a little bit more about the genetic basis of diabetes, the history of it, why we've come to understand type 1 as a genetic disorder, and how that has shaped the research, how that has shaped diabetics' perception of healing diabetes, and how that can change. So I want to thank you all for being here, and let's go ahead and dive right in. So, like I said, my name's Bowie. I've had diabetes for 21 years. Started at age 8. That was back in August of 2001. I am currently insulin dependent and a pump user, so I use the Omnipod. And for the past 2 years, really, this is a culmination of my whole life. But in the past 2 years, I have started digging a lot deeper into alternative routes of healing. That has involved questioning the current understanding of diabetes, which has led to a lot of really, really exciting breakthroughs on the fronts of nutrition, supplementation, mineral balance, things like that, as well as herbal remedies and detoxification. So, along with all of this, I've just gotten a much greater understanding of organ systems, the immune system, the endocrine system, and I'm here to share it because, like I said, I am just floored by my success in managing my diabetes, and the information is too good not to share and not to help you all. So, now this is my diabetic journey. I'm gonna tell this in the context of the genetic basis of diabetes and the Cliff Notes version that everyone sort of gets when they get diagnosed, if they even get that Cliff Notes version. So, when you're diagnosed with diabetes, obviously you're sick, you're brought in, no one's quite sure what it is. If they find out immediately, which, some do, some don't, everyone kind of has their own triggering event that causes you to kind of pass that threshold of non-diabetic to diabetic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you're brought into the hospital. They have this whole wonderful, wonderful onboarding process with diabetic educators, with endocrinologists, about what it is to be diabetic. So you learn about product and technology around diabetes. Again, I was diagnosed back in 2001. There were no CGMs. It was still all manual blood sugar tests. There was a pump, if not a couple pumps. I was a Medtronic, the MiniMed Medtronic Paradigm pump, but again, it was still early in the technology. Either way, you are getting the lowdown on how to use it, what you're using it for, right? I was 8 when I learned what a carb was and what that meant for my body. And so you learn all of the things that go into managing a blood sugar. That's what you eat, when you eat it, when you give yourself insulin, what exercise does for you. And basically you're kind of just given padding. You're like, okay, you're going to need to carry fast acting sugar around. Here's how to use a glucagon. And here's what experiencing low blood sugar and high blood sugar feels like. So those types of things. In terms of actually describing what diabetes is, as opposed to just treating and managing it and going about your everyday life, the explanation was brief. So again, the Cliff Notes version, your immune system attacked itself. That's kind of the whole autoimmune disease theory. So the autoimmune system targeted your beta cells specifically. Those are what created insulin, and without insulin, your blood sugar goes uncontrolled. Now, why me? That's usually the question most diabetics get in the endocrinologist's office. Like, why did I get it? I have two sisters that are not diabetic. What gives? And they say, oh well, it's of a genetic origin. This is for type 1. Type 1 is of a genetic origin. We're not sure exactly why that is, but there's a lot of really great research going into finding out why. And then that's kind of where that explanation ends. There really isn't any more information given. There is no resources to get any updates or anything like that. It's genetic. That's all we know about it. We'll let you know if we hear anything back. So, but again, if you stop to think about it, because again, becoming diabetic is a traumatic event, right? Your life changes. You're not sure. You're treading in uncharted waters, and so the pressure and the newness of being diabetic now kind of takes over any space for curiosity that you could have had to have asked meaningful questions about why what happened. You're too busy trying to figure out how you're going to live your life now, right? So here's kind of a good way to break down that Cliff Notes version of diabetes that everyone's told. So it's a genetic origin. Don't know why. Those with those genes have a lot of inflammation. That inflammation could have come from a triggering event, whether an illness, an infection, or some sort of emotional trauma. So my personal triggering event was Lyme disease. So I had Lyme disease in the summer of 2001, and I had been put on antibiotics to treat that. And at the end of my antibiotic cycle, I was not feeling any better. I was still very sick, going to the bathroom like crazy, lost a ton of weight, vomiting, diarrhea, what have you. And they said, oh man, okay, so maybe it wasn't Lyme. They brought me back in, and turns out I was type 1 diabetic. Now, there are people who have had infections, like bacterial infections that have triggered it. Certain viruses that have come about that have kind of pushed people over the edge into being diabetic. And this is something that I learned recently in my sharings through TikTok, is that people have gone through emotional trauma, soldiers coming back from war, deaths in family. There is things strictly emotional and not so invasive as an infection or an illness, but people developing diabetes after emotional trauma. So, something to do with that vicious cocktail of, yes, your genetic code, the resulting inflammation, as well as that triggering event, all leading to the death of your beta cells, which are not growing at a fast enough rate for you to be able to regenerate them. That inflammation is kind of never truly identified and addressed, the source of it rather. So, you're kind of fighting a losing battle by trying to regrow those beta cells anyway. But every diabetic is assured there's nothing you could have done. It's in your genes. That's all there is, right? So I remember specifically my family asking, okay, well, was there anything in our diet that we could have changed? What do we need to monitor now? What stays, what goes? And the doctor said that we needed to make no changes to our diets. And that was probably breezed over pretty quickly and not really dwelled upon by anyone in my family. Food was never really a priority in our house. In terms of quality or anything like that. So it was just kind of like, okay, well, we'll just kind of keep going like we were before. And so again, the the whole thing is that, okay, by labeling it genetic, that takes the power away from anything else that could possibly influence the expression of those genes, right? So if you are a type 1 diabetic and you're interested in healing, if you're told it's genetic, that takes the power right out of your hands, right? The average person is not a geneticist, is not a lab coat, doesn't have their doctorate. They're like, whoa, that is way above my pay grade, right? So um, if you asked anybody on the street about what their understanding of what genes were, it'd be like, it's like, oh, the blueprint of the body, it's kind of become synonymous with, well, that's just the way it is, right? It's like, oh, well, it must be in your genes, you're stuck with it. So um, for a diabetic hoping for the possibility of healing, by labeling it, oh, it's in your genes, that immediately imposes restriction on what's possible for healing, right? Because, I mean, there's no known cures for something in the genes, right? That would be oxymoronic, because you can't cure your genes. They're your genes. The genes are what make you you. So that loss of control has cost us in curiosity in exploring alternative means of healing, right? Because again, it's in our genes. That's who I am. There's nothing I can do about it, right? So our imagination and our hope for anything better has immediately been impacted. So from then on, right, in that summer of 2001, we got that Cliff Notes version of why Bowie had developed type 1 diabetes, and that there wasn't anything we could do with that, and that we would just have to wait for the latest news on, gene therapy or transplants. So talking genes, I mentioned a little bit before, talking genes immediately takes the public's grasp of their connection to the solution away. If you say it's genetic, your average Joe is like, man, I have no idea about genes. There's no way I can influence my genes, right? They're just too complicated for me to be able to manipulate. But if you allow that question to stand, is it genetic? Or what does it being genetic mean? And just kind of sit with it. There are a couple meaningful follow-up questions that are worth having asked. And that is, what are those genes? And are you sure? Because again, is this like, oh, the scarlet letter, where it's just like, okay, if you've got this gene, then there's no question that's why you're diabetic. So I realized, I mentioned 2 years ago I started diving a little bit deeper. No one had ever asked that question, right? What are those genes that cause type 1 diabetes? What is that gene, or what are those genes? Like, is it one? Is it many? Is it a combination? What are we dealing with? And so I asked. And so these are the questions I came up with. What genes or gene combinations are tied to diabetes? Are they tied to anything else, right? Because again, most diabetics are not just dealing with diabetes. That autoimmune disorder comes with a family of other things, whether that be thyroid, whether that be gut health issues, whether that be, it could be just about anything, liver conditions. So what else are we dealing with? And why are those things, right? Like, so someone with Hashimoto's disease, which is a thyroid disorder, if there's a genetic tie to Hashimoto's, why are people with Hashimoto's not being told that it's genetic, there's nothing we can do about it, like type 1 diabetics? That was kind of my question. Why is type 1 diabetes different from other autoimmune conditions in terms of its genetic origins? And then does having those genes or that gene guarantee diabetes? Why or why not? And have there been advancements in our understanding of these genes since their initial discovery? Now, this last question is huge because I chatted with a friend of a family member who had just recently been diagnosed, and I asked them about what they were told in their endocrinologist, like basically their onboarding process. What was your onboarding process like? So I wanted to see what it was like now versus what it was like when I had it, the 20-year difference. And there was not a lot of difference. And that's alarming. Like, that's concerning. 20 years have gone by and people are getting the same story. We have no better understanding of the genetic nature of type 1 diabetes. And I've talked about this before in previous podcasts, but for when I started my TikTok channel sharing more things about diabetes, I got the attention of a lot of type 2 diabetics, and I was shocked at how little these people who had been dealing with this disease for years and years and years, how little they understood about the disease itself. So, it's like, oh, that's a problem in education, but is the establishment responsible, quote unquote, responsible for educating? Are they improving their understanding at all either? So I started to ask these questions and I started to look things up. So this is an excerpt from the website Medline Plus. And so this is kind of like a catalog of illnesses, diseases, and all of the information about them. So I looked up the genetic nature of type 1 diabetes. So causes of type 1 diabetes are unknown. Several risk factors have been identified. And then it talks about the gene variants. Okay, so I want you to focus kind of on those first three letters, HLA, right? So HLA, then you have, DQA1, DQB1, DRB1 genes, but HLA is the kind of the main family of those genes. So these genes provide instructions for making proteins that play a critical role in the immune system. And then it goes on to say that HLA stands for human leukocyte antigen complex. That's what that HLA. So pause for a second there. Let's just break that word down, right? So human, obviously, it's for us because we're human. Leukocyte is another word for white blood cell, right? So a leukocyte is a white blood cell. And when you think of white blood cell, that should be synonymous in your mind with having to do with immunity, right? White blood cells are kind of pictured as the soldiers of the immune system, protecting us from antigens. Antigens are foreign bodies, toxins, pathogens, things like that our body identifies as other. So in that last sentence, the HLA complex helps the immune system distinguish the body's own proteins from proteins made by foreign invaders, such as viruses and bacteria. So this aligns perfectly with our autoimmune disease understanding of the development of type 1 diabetes, right? So if HLA is responsible for distinguishing between self and other, and there's an issue with that, then that explains why our immune system, quote unquote, attacked the beta cell, right? Because it misidentified the beta cell as foreign and it eliminated it, right? So when I looked a little bit further into that HLA complex, obviously, like I mentioned before, it's involved in distinguishing foreign pathogens from bodily proteins, but it has ties to all sorts of autoimmune conditions. And you'll see there in that first bullet, on the second bullet down, half of all genetic variables resulting in autoimmune conditions are traced to changes in the HLA genes, right? So this is a hotbed for the development of autoimmune conditions. Okay, so the conditions included rheumatoid arthritis, hemochromatosis, which is iron overload, lupus, and multiple sclerosis, right? So all of these conditions where the body's immune system is perceived to have attacked itself, it ties back to the HLA complex. Now, the thing that this opened my mind up to, like when you hear someone suffers from arthritis, right? You don't hear that it's genetic, do you? I don't, right? Like or my dad specifically has arthritis. And again, he's not getting the genetic talk like, oh, it's genetic. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, he's getting a prescription to take care of it. But again, no mention of genes, no mention of a genetic origin, and that there's nothing he could do about it. So for me, that opened up the possibility of like, okay, well, why wouldn't type 1 diabetes be treated the same? And the same goes for all of those other ones, iron overload, lupus, and multiple sclerosis as well. And again, that is not a comprehensive list. There are more conditions associated with those HLAs. Like I said, half of those autoimmune conditions. So pretty impressive. Now, this is from that same website, that Medline Plus, that distinguished what HLA actually was. So in those variants associated with type 1 diabetes, which are called haplotypes, right? The DQA1, the DQB1. So there are certain haplotypes, or we'll just call them versions of the gene, that are associated with the higher risk of developing type 1 diabetes. Now, these versions seem to increase the risk of the inappropriate immune response against the beta cells, right? Because that's really all we're interested in as diabetics, because our HLA gene variants targeted our beta cells. So, but get this, however, these variants are also found in the general population, and only about 5% of individuals with the gene variants develop type 1 diabetes. So what you're saying is that we're being told that type 1 diabetes is genetic because we have these variants of those HLA genes. And that there's, that's what it is. Sorry, we're still figuring things out. But that there are a lot more people in the general population with those exact same genes that do not have type 1 diabetes. Not only that there are others, that the majority of those with the same genes that we have don't have type 1 diabetes. 5%? That is so not convincing. That is not at all convincing. So only 5% of the people with the quote-unquote type 1 diabetes genes are actually type 1 diabetic. That plants seeds of doubt in my mind. Big, big seeds of doubt. Okay, so then you scroll down to the bottom. Additional contributors such as environmental factors and variations in other genes are also thought to influence the development of this complex disorder. So, turns out the specific gene combinations tied to type 1 diabetes are also found in the general population, only of which 5%, so 95% of the people that have the same genes that got you type 1 diabetes don't have type 1 diabetes. That is not a strong correlation. So may those gene complexes or versions of that gene have a tie to diabetes, or maybe serve as a contributing factor? Maybe. But is it a certainty? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So what are those confounding variables in the 5% that having those genes caused us to pass the threshold into type 1 diabetes? So where do we go from here, right? dealing with where we're coming from. Type 1s are typically so quick to dismiss the possibility of a cure outside of gene therapy and transplants based on this one assumption. And I'm experiencing this through the social media posts that I'm sharing about my healing journey. So I'll talk about my success as a type 1 diabetic with herbal remedies, supplementation, establishing mineral balance, cell health. And type 1 diabetics are the first ones to speak up and say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to type 1 because it's genetic and there's nothing we can do. And they don't stop to ask, wait, are you type 1? And I'm like, yes, I am type 1 and I am experiencing this. This whole genetic story that we've been told is so weak and does not hold under pressure, right? And you realize that when you take away just that assumption that because it's genetic and there's nothing that we can do, it opens so many doors for our ability to manipulate and impact the expression of those genes and manipulate change and improve our conditions. So then that branches into what things have an effect on gene expression, right? So obviously they mentioned the external environmental factors, right? So toxins, pollutants, we're talking about fluoride, we're talking about, household cleaning products, the soaps that you use, what's going on with your light. Are you just flooded with blue light from your phone and your camera? Are you getting enough sunlight outside? What's your circadian rhythm like? What's your sleep like? And then what's your internal environment like? And this has been my whole focus, right? If it's not the genes themselves and it's the cellular environment that influences the gene's expression, what are the things that serve to feed the cellular environment? That is your food. That is the water that you drink. There's no other way around it. Your food and your water. So what have we learned? Where did we get here? And again, I could stay on that food and water thing for the longest time in terms of establishing mineral balance. There will be more content going into the ins and outs of each of those things and where I see this going. But just know that food and your water and your mental health all play a significant part in your developing diabetes, type 1 and type 2. All of those things have a critical role in the expression of your genes, whether or not you have them or not, right? Because we've seen having them doesn't matter. There needs to be something else that contributes to the expression, the particular expression of those genes, right? So there is something that we can do. So let's take a quick little recap, right? What have we learned? Those HLA genes, right? The human leukocyte antigen complex genes are tied to many autoimmune conditions, including type 1 diabetes, things like rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, things that have not been labeled as genetic and that those with those conditions are not told that there's nothing that they can do. There are more than one of these gene complexes tied to type 1 diabetes, and none of them strictly correlate to being diabetic. In fact, 95% of the people with those same genes do not have diabetes. So this forces us to consider the possibility that genes are not the cause of the issue, but perhaps simply a contributing factor. So again, what does it all mean? Where are we going? What can I do with this, right? So we need to invest in learning more about what things influence gene expression. I touched upon the external and the internal environment things: food, water, lighting, mental health, cleaning up our external space and our internal space. So think about more about your triggering event, right? So a lot of people at least through TikTok, I know, talk a lot about parasites, kind of a parasitic origin of diabetes. And again, I'm not claiming to know any one way over the other. Like I said, I had Lyme disease, which is a bacterial infection, a spirochete. Lots of other people have had a lot of different things that led to their diagnosis. But start asking questions about what those things did to your body and what connection they may have with affecting your cellular environment and thus your genetic expression. And then prioritize cleaning up your environment. You have to clean up your eating, you have to clean your home, and you have to clean your mind. These are all of the things that are going to set your body up at the cellular level to become healthier. Okay? And what does all of this mean? It means that you have the power to influence your genes. You have the power to influence your diabetes. You have the power to heal. The power lies in you. The cure is not limited to geneticists and scientists like we've been convinced for the past decade and decade after that, right? So again, the cure is with us. The cure is with us. There's nothing saying that anyone who manages their environment and restores bodily balance cannot restore pancreatic function. Again, you're not going to find anything confirming that yet, but I would argue that's because no one is looking. So do not live and die by your genes or the story that you've been told about your genes. Look things up for yourself. Look things up for yourself. That is the greatest gift I ever gave myself, was to ask a question when I didn't like the answer I got, or I saw that the answer was not complete. I completed it myself. All right. So that is the end of the episode here. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Again, this is episode 8, Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. My name is Bowie Madison, signing off. Again, we can do this. A diabetic will be the first person to heal their diabetes. You heard it here first. All right. Thanks again for being here, and enjoy the day.